Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting radio-exclusive offer just for you. For a limited time, you can get a free Pocket Pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just text WATER to 64,000. That's WATER to 64,000 for your 2 free gifts with purchase. WATER to 64,000.
By texting 64,000, you agree to receive recurring automated marketing messages from Pocket Hose. Message and data rates may apply. No purchase required. Terms apply. Available at pockethose.com/terms.
When the protest began in Los Angeles, the images on television did look scary. And I texted a friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles and said, I hope you're safe and, be careful. And she was like, we just went to the beach. Like everything is fine,
Right. That's part of it. That's part of it, right? Like I've been talking to people in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And they're saying, yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. It's too
Right.
bad.
I'm Kimberly Atkins Stohr, and this is Justice by Design. And as I sit here in Washington, D.C., there is a big show preparing to be put on Saturday. One that will involve President Trump and a military-style parade. There are already tanks that can be seen being carted through the city of DC in preparation. And that creates quite a split screen as there are actual troops being deployed in Los Angeles, and the president is promising that they can be deployed in other cities if the citizens there choose to protest against the ICE raids that are going on across the country. To me, this looks like a certain sign of authoritarianism, but I want to better understand where we are in this moment, what the laws and limits are, and what we as citizens can do. And so I am so glad to be joined today by Elizabeth Goitein, who is Senior Director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Liza, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I always begin by asking my guests to introduce themselves a little bit. So let our listeners know a little bit about you and what you do there at Brennan.
Sure. So I am Senior Director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center. This program was established after 9/11. So it is not as old as the Brennan Center itself. But we seek to advance effective national security policies that respect constitutional values and the rule of law. That is the purpose of the program. And I've been at the Brennan Center for about 16 years. Before that, I was working on the Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Feingold. And before that, I was at the Department of Justice for several years. So I've been both in and out of government.
And I will link your very good analysis in Just Security that is entitled Unpacking Trump's Order Authorizing Domestic Deployment of the Military. It's really helpful, and our listeners should take a look at that. But let's have our discussion now. I thought, us both being lawyers, but recognizing that most of the listeners are not, just sort of starting out with the law and where we are and how the president is using it.
Right.
And so what just comes to mind for me is you have the Posse Comitatus Act, which basically prohibits the use of the military in any sort of law enforcement capacity on U.S. soil. But it has some limitations, and that's where other laws such as the National Emergency Act and the Insurrection Act come in. So just sort of explaining generally, what power does the president have when the general rule under the Posse Comitatus Act is that members of the military are never supposed to serve in a law enforcement capacity on U.S. soil against U.S. citizens?
So the Posse Comitatus Act is really at the heart of all of this. And that is the law that prohibits federal armed forces from participating directly in core law enforcement activities. And that's going to be important. Those are activities such as arrests and searches and seizures, unless it has been expressly authorized through an act of Congress or the Constitution. That is the general rule. Congress has legislated exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act. And the main exception, the one that applies in situations like, it arguably doesn't apply, but the one that has been used for civil unrest situations is the Insurrection Act. And that law gives the president on its face a significant amount of discretion to deploy federal troops to quell civil unrest or to enforce the law in a crisis. Now, President Trump hasn't relied on the Insurrection Act. He didn't invoke it. He is doing something fairly unprecedented, which is he is using a law. I'm just going to say the numbers. It's 10 U.S.C. 12406. I wish it had a catchy name. It doesn't. But this is a law that allows the president to federalize the National Guard in certain situations. Those situations, some of them kind of map on a little bit to some of the substantive criteria in the Insurrection Act, but it has not previously been treated or used as sort of a mini Insurrection Act. It has not been used as a standalone authority to deploy troops to quell civil unrest. And in fact, it's been used almost always as a sort of technical call-up authority. So it is the law that transfers control from the governor to the president, control of the National Guard. But then to actually deploy the troops for civil unrest purposes to enforce the law, the presidents have relied on the Insurrection Act.
So I want to be really clear about what we're talking about, because the president has done two things. One, which is basically do a workaround against around the governor of California by calling up the National Guard, which is usually something that is the authority of the states to do in certain circumstances, but also deployed active duty members of the military, the Marines, to Los Angeles as well. So is it both of those under this act?
No, so you anticipated where I was going.
Got it. Okay, sorry.
No, it's fine. 10 U.S.C. 12406, unlike the Insurrection Act, does not authorize deployment of federal troops, of active duty armed forces. Mm-hmm. When the National Guard is federalized, it becomes part of the federal armed forces. Okay. But the active duty armed forces cannot be deployed under 10 U.S.C. 12406. And the president hasn't invoked the Insurrection Act. So for that action, the authority that the president is relying on is a claim of inherent constitutional authority to deploy troops to protect federal property and functions. And this is a long-standing claim that the executive branch has made, that they have this power, this inherent constitutional power. There are a couple of court cases that sort of gesture at that power, but what no court has ever looked at is how that power would interact with the Posse Comitatus Act. Mm-hmm. And so if in the course of protecting federal property and functions, the military is being tasked with or simply ends up performing core law enforcement functions like arrests and searches and seizures, that certainly looks like a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. So how would that play out? So we are in kind of uncharted legal territory here with the authorities the president is relying on. Now, as of now, even though the military is deployed into Los Angeles, right, in the hundreds, they are not engaging in arrests, searches, and seizures. They are not engaging in activities that we would think of as, or that the courts have looked at as being core law enforcement activities. However, we are still in a situation where the military has been deployed into a major city, and some of the concerns about underlying the Posse Comitatus Act are triggered here, even if the law itself isn't triggered, because having the military come into our cities and our towns in armored vehicles and stand there in uniform with their heavy weaponry, that has a real chilling effect on, certainly on protest activity, including peaceful protest activity. So a lot of the concerns that are part of the reason why we have this separation between the military and civilian law enforcement are present here, even if technically there's been no violation.
Yes, and one of the questions I want to ask you is how these laws also interface with the First Amendment. But first, I want to point out, as you do in your Just Security piece, that on Saturday, the president purportedly authorized the federalization and deployment of the National Guard, as you were talking about, at locations, quote, at locations where protests against ICE functions are occurring or are likely to occur based on current threat assessments and planned operations. Now, I want to be very clear. What we have seen so far from the reporting is that the protests that happened in Los Angeles were contained to a couple of blocks. It was not a situation like, if you recall, after the Rodney King incident in the 90s, where it was really widespread violence and uprising happening. That is not what was happening here, but that was enough for the president to act, not just, and this isn't limited to Los Angeles. This basically says the president has declared that he has the power to do this anywhere where people might be protesting against ICE. I will add that to also the president going to Fort Bragg and giving a speech and having some members of the military cheer and chant USA as this is all going on, Liza. That to me feels like something so different than I can imagine. I can remember happening, anything close to that happening in this democracy of the United States of America. So what, as somebody who has spent your whole career looking at these, how is this ringing to you?
Right. So the deployment of the military in Los Angeles was inappropriate for the reasons you say. There were isolated incidents of violence and vandalism. That's not acceptable, but that is the type of thing that should be, is routinely handled by state and local law enforcement, and it's their responsibility under the Constitution, certainly in the first instance. So that was not an appropriate use of the military. But when you look at the memorandum and what it authorizes, which, as you said, is the deployment of troops anywhere in the country where protests against ICE activity are occurring, regardless of whether there is any violence. That is not one of the criteria that's set forth. Any violence, any vandalism, any law breaking, any interference with federal functions. It authorizes deployment anywhere protests are occurring against ICE activity or where they're likely to occur. So obviously in those cases, there's no violence. You can't say state and local law enforcement are overwhelmed when nothing is happening. This nationwide preemptive deployment of the military to effectively police protests is completely unprecedented. It is not something that happens in a democracy. It is not something that happens or has happened in the United States. It is something that happens in China. It is something that happens in authoritarian regimes. So this should just be a huge red flag. And, lest anyone think this is limited to ICE protests, and maybe some people are not planning to protest ICE activity. 2 days ago, President Trump said that any protester who came out on Saturday to protest the military parade would be met with very heavy force.
Yes.
Nowhere in any, when I went on for a little bit talking about it, nowhere in there did he talk about violence, vandalism, interfering with federal functions. Anyone who protests will be met with force. This is, so we know, right, that this isn't about violence. This isn't about interference with federal functions. This is about suppressing lawful and peaceful dissent against the actions of the government. And that is probably the most fundamental right we have in a democracy.
And in this case, I can't underscore enough. I live in Washington, D.C. There's not protests that are disrupting anything about how the city is moving. The disruption will be this military parade, which is styled to be a celebration of the Army's birthday, happens to coincidentally coincide with the president's birthday. But this is something that the president is choosing to do. This is not, if people go and also protest that ought to be covered by the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects the right to speak, the right to assemble, the right to petition government. It basically protects the right to protest peacefully. But as you said, being peaceful is not a trigger under this. It's just anybody. It seems like it's just a suppression of any sort of dissent. So how does the First Amendment interface here with what the president is doing either here in DC, in Los Angeles, or in some other city?
Right. Well, certainly it is having First Amendment effects already. I was listening to the radio, and there was a woman who was interviewed in Los Angeles who had come out to protest, and then she said, "Oh, I see the military is arresting people, or might arrest people. I think they're not arresting people yet." She was worried about what would happen in terms of being arrested, and she said, "I'm just going to go home. This is too much. I can't take this risk," essentially. And thousands of people are going to make that calculus, and so this is suppressing protest. It is having a major First Amendment effect. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get into court on these kinds of First Amendment violations because, right now there's no criminal prohibition on anyone, coming out to protest. Obviously, you'd have a pretty good First Amendment lawsuit right there. What basically it is what the Supreme Court has said said a while ago is a subjective chill, and a subjective chill is not enough to even have standing to sue. So I think we're going to have to start to see something more than just a fear of what could happen. I think if we start to see soldiers, laying hands on civilians who are not engaging in any violence, any sort of law breaking, at that point, yes, you would have a First Amendment claim.
So I just sort of want to ask, what are the guardrails here? Because when members of the military are deployed to a war zone in a wartime situation, or even a peacekeeping operation, there are rules. There are rules of engagement. Are there any sort of rules of engagement when it comes to the deployment of military on U.S. soil? What are there limits to what they can and cannot do? Absolutely,
because sometimes the military is deployed on U.S. soil, right? I mean, it is meant to be the extremely rare exception to the rule, but it's happened. The Insurrection Act has been invoked 30 times in U.S. history. And there are rules called the standing rules for use of force for when the military acts inside the United States with civilian populations that are very different from the standing rules of engagement that apply when the military operates overseas. And the military in general is trained in the standing rules for use of force. However, the rules of engagement for any given situation, they are supposed to comply with these standing rules, but they can be tweaked, they can be altered, they can be made more specific. And last I checked, and it might have changed since then, the Department of Defense was still hammering out the rules of engagement as the troops were being sent to Los Angeles. So this is not a situation where these troops are going to have spent a whole lot of time familiarizing themselves with these rules of engagement. And we don't know, and we might not know, what the rules of engagement are. And frankly, regardless of what the rules of engagement are, there's a bigger issue here, which is that soldiers, especially active duty armed soldiers, are not trained to act as domestic police officers. They do not have that training. Now, they are being given, I think, 2 days of training right now. That is 2 days sort of in comparison of the years of training that they have had in what is their actual job, which is fighting and destroying an enemy.
Right.
And that is what they do better than any armed forces in the world, right? That has been their training, their mission, their culture, their experience, not, policing civilian populations in a way that de-escalates conflict, in a way that respects the constitutional rights of the Americans they're interacting with. So when you thrust them into this position, it's a safety issue. It is a safety issue, not just for the civilians with whom they're interacting, but frankly for the soldiers too, and for the state and local law enforcement agents who are also there trying to do their jobs.
That's absolutely right. And I'm glad that you bring up that point, is that for the members of the military who enlisted, who signed up to be at the ready to protect the United States against mostly against foreign threats, but as you said, from time to time, U.S. threats, the job that is fundamentally different than that of police officers who protect communities. The training is different, the job is different, and so they are not interchangeable. And this actually puts troops in a difficult situation.
Very, very. And when this is, when it's happened in the past, there and now too, I've seen some things on social media where members of the armed forces themselves say, "This isn't why I joined the army. I didn't join it to police my fellow citizens, and I'm worried this isn't safe to sort of have us in this position." So it is not fair to the soldiers either.
So I mentioned the president's speech at Fort Bragg. I'm not going to ask you to put yourself inside the president's head, but for someone giving what felt like a pep rally for members of the military ahead of this parade, and as the situation in Los Angeles stands, at the precipice of escalating, what does history tell us about strong men who see the military as their own extension? That's not normally, yes, a president is commander in chief, but the military is meant to work for the United States, for the American people. Trump seems to be sort of commandeering it for his own purposes that, as we've been discussing, the military isn't even set up for. What has history taught us about such demonstrations of military force by strongman leaders?
Well, I would say that this is why we have a Posse Comitatus Act in the first place, right? It is based on a history that goes, the principle behind the Posse Comitatus Act is centuries old, even though the law itself was passed in 1878. That principle goes all the way back to the Magna Carta. What we have seen in history over and over is that when leaders can turn the military against the people, against their own people, and use the military as their personal police force, that becomes an instrument of tyranny, of oppression. It is the death knell for individual liberties in those countries. And now in the modern era, it is an enormous threat to democracy. That's exactly why we have that power. That's exactly why we have the Posse Comitatus Act. But also something you were saying about how the president is using it sort of politically in a way, right? He is using it he's using the military in a way to further his political agenda, and which is both, deportations and also being seen to be very aggressive in these deportations. And so that is dragging the military into domestic politics, which is something that our military has scrupulously avoided. Right? Is the U.S. military is or has been one of the most respected institutions in this country, and part of it is because, unlike some of the other institutions that score very low in terms of popular approval, like Congress and pretty much any sort of political office or officer, they are seen to be acting above politics, and they defend Americans no matter what the Americans' politics, what their ideology, what their creed, their race, religion, any of that. They defend those Americans against threats from hostile foreign powers, right? And that is a huge part of what gives the military, such legitimacy and support in this country. If that changes, if the military is going to be dragged into this political firestorm, that has real potential harmful impacts on the military itself, on civil military relations, what the public thinks of the military, and then potentially looking forward on recruitment and retention and professionalism of the military forces going forward. So it is a huge risk to the military to be doing this.
And just, underscoring the political aspect of this, even before the ICE raids began, even before the president assumed office again, as he was campaigning, he said he vowed to use the military and send them into cities on the basis of crime fighting, where cities that he would call crime ridden and say without any evidence to support it. Places like Chicago, he talked about, and other places, he talked openly about wanting to send the military in there. So it seemed that there was already this idea on his part that this is what strong leadership looks like, when, as we've been discussing, that is not at all the role. So what, I want to turn to solutions here, because that's what I try to focus on in this podcast. And this is the purview in many ways of the states. Conservatives, the Republican Party has long claimed to be a party of states' rights. We've already discussed calling up the National Guard is traditionally a function of the states. The president did not wait for the governor of California to do that. There's now litigation over that. But as we said, I don't think that the courts are going to get us out of this moment that we are in today. That may give us some clarity down the road. But what, if anything, can states who say, look, we have our own law enforcement under our own control, is there anything that they could do to prevent this from happening in other cities?
Unfortunately, there's really not much states can do to prevent the federalization of the National Guard, certainly under the Insurrection Act. It is being litigated right now whether the president can unilaterally federalize the National Guard under this other statute, 10 U.S.C. 12406. There's actually a real question there that the courts will soon answer. But if President Trump were then to say, okay, well, then I'm just going to invoke the Insurrection Act, there is very, very little that governors can do in advance to prevent that, or to prevent it in the moment. Now, what they can do is, if the president has clearly exceeded his authority under the Insurrection Act, they can bring suit. And if the National Guard has been federalized, they will very likely have standing to bring suit. And so they can challenge in the courts. I mean, the other thing that they can do, frankly, is to do everything in their power to make sure that protests stay peaceful. And obviously that is, of course, on the protesters as well, right? I mean, people coming out to protest, they should not be throwing rocks. They should not be, engaging in acts of vandalism, needless to say. Or maybe it needs to be said. But the other thing that we've seen is that the response, whether it's state, local law enforcement, or the National Guard, can either escalate or de-escalate the situation. And so making sure that the forces that the state are deploying, which is going to be state and local law enforcement for the most part, are doing their job to de-escalate the situation and not to unnecessarily escalate through unnecessary use of force, even if it's this less lethal force. So I do think that's part of what states can do to try to make sure that these protests, that they take away any possible sort of pretext that that President Trump might have for deploying the federal military. Now, I'm not sure ultimately it will matter much, since Trump has said that he's going to meet any protest with force, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of whether there's violence. And since his memorandum authorizes deployment of troops, regardless of whether there's force. So we might ultimately not make a difference, but, I think it probably will. And it will certainly make a difference in the eyes of courts, who are looking at these exercises of authority by the president and determining whether those exercises were justified and lawful.
And I think it will make a big difference in terms of the visualization. I mean, I think what is driving the escalation here is this idea that can be put forward in pictures, on television, on news broadcasts that look like there is chaos. And if
Right.
there is not
Yeah.
an actual chaos and you have troops going in, it will not be the picture, in my opinion, that it seems that, you know, the picture of having this strong response to lawlessness, if the lawlessness isn't visualized, then
Yeah, and
you
that's
won't
tough
really see
though,
that.
because the way that social media works, I mean, the images we're
Yeah,
seeing, you'll see, tear gas and a shadowy figure running through it, or you'll see like a
sure.
barrel on fire, and it looks like the whole city is under siege. But if
It
you were to
does.
pan out, you would see that it's a corner of one block of the city where everything else is proceeding as normal. So
Right.
it is very, very hard to sort of fight back against, or to deal with the ways in which these kind of images can be exploited
Yeah.
and can form the basis for claims that things are happening that aren't really happening. So when President Trump says Los Angeles is being destroyed, it's being obliterated, and then you see this one shot of
Right.
one
Of
place,
Waymo's on fire.
yeah, where one thing is happening, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I think the way you know that Los Angeles isn't being obliterated or destroyed is because if it were being destroyed, the mayor would ask for help. There is no mayor in the country that is on board with their city being destroyed. That's not
Right.
a thing, right? So I think that, but it can be hard for people who are not there, right? Looking at these images to really directly perceive what's happening.
That's a really fair and important point. I mean, even when the protest began in Los Angeles, the images on television did look scary, and I texted a friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles and said, "I hope you're safe and be careful." And she was like, "We just went to the beach. Like everything
Right.
is fine."
Right.
Well,
that's part of it. That's part of it, right? Like I've been talking to people in Los Angeles,
yeah,
and they're saying, "Yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. It's 2 blocks in downtown."
That's
so that's helpful, actually, is to sort of do your own research,
Yeah.
right, in terms of having some kind of impression of what's actually happening.
That's absolutely true. Now, what I know in the moment, in the instance, it's hard for the courts or certainly lawmakers to do anything. But is it? What is the role of Congress and the courts here? We're talking
It's
about
not
the
hard if
actions
they
of
want to.
Yeah. Go ahead. Say more on that.
If they, well, I mean, there is the Posse Comitatus Act, right? But clearly, or maybe not clearly, it is not sufficient for the current situation. Now, part of the issue is that as of now, National Guard and federal active duty armed forces have not engaged in any of these actions that are considered to be core law enforcement actions, which includes detentions or searches or things like that. It's hard for me to imagine that won't actually happen because, even if they're just standing there in a line, all it will take is sort of one person trying to walk across that line. What are they going to do? How are they going to avoid laying hands on that person, at which point they've crossed this Posse Comitatus Act line?
Right.
So, and then at that point, there are questions about how you enforce the Posse Comitatus Act. It's a criminal statute, right? It allows for charges to be brought against people. But it's very unsettled whether it actually can form the basis of a civil lawsuit. So that's an issue, right? Congress could change that. Congress could say, yes, absolutely, if Posse Comitatus is violated, you can sue. That would be helpful, right? But also, I think what we need to look at is these legal authorizations to deploy troops in the first place, even before you get to the point of whether they are violating Posse Comitatus or not, and what the criteria are. And those criteria have been set forward in terms that are simply too vague and that are not defined and that give too much leeway. That is something that Congress could change and should change. Congress could also make sure that there are checks in place in case there is overreach, including Congress's own ability to shut down an abuse of power, which right now, really the only way that Congress could stop something that's in progress is to pass a law by a veto-proof supermajority, presumably. right? So Congress could work in there something like these domestic deployment authorities have a time limit, have a very short time limit, after which Congress has to approve in order for the authority to continue. So these are some ideas for ways to change the law that would provide a better safeguard against abuse. That's
Yeah.
can lead the horse to water, but it has to want to drink. Is that no?
Yes.
I don't. You get my point.
Yes, I totally get the point. I mean, it seems like an exercise in future proofing from based on what we're seeing now. But there's also, speaking of future proofing, this idea. One reason that we got to this point is the use, in my opinion, I would say overuse of emergency powers by the president. This president has issued a flurry of executive orders declaring emergencies over things like immigration, an area just to remind listeners, the president already has an immense amount of power when it comes to immigration power in the United States, but he's claiming more by declaring these emergencies in the same way that he did during his first term during the pandemic, using the pandemic to declare the need to exercise these emergency powers. What is the role of Congress and the courts in maybe reining those in because they're being used in a way that they weren't designed to be?
Right. So you have the same issue here, which is that you have a law that gives tremendous discretion without sufficient checks against abuse. And that's the National Emergencies Act. That law allows the president to declare a national emergency. And that declaration unlocks powers that are contained in about 150 different laws, all of which say something like, in a national emergency, the president can do X. And so, national emergencies had been declared by presidents long before the National Emergencies Act was passed. There just wasn't an overarching law sort of governing the process, but you still had all these laws Congress had passed saying this can happen in a national emergency, and presidents would just declare them. The National Emergencies Act was passed actually to rein in presidential uses of emergencies powers. And the main way that it tried to do that was through a mechanism called a legislative veto, under which Congress can vote to terminate the emergency declaration, and the president doesn't have to sign it into law. It's just a majority vote of both houses in Congress. In 1983, which was several years after the National Emergencies Act was passed, the Supreme Court held that legislative vetoes are unconstitutional. So this really critical safeguard in the law was stripped out, even though all of the powers remain. So what Congress could do now and should do now is to try to restore its own role as a check against abuse and try to restore the balance of power between Congress and the president by, again, requiring these powers that it granted to expire after a certain period of time. For national emergency declaration, 30 days is the time period that members of Congress have sort of coalesced around. And then those authorities would end after 30 days unless Congress voted to extend them using expedited procedures that would allow any member to force a vote and that would prevent filibustering. So the idea isn't to make it impossible to continue an emergency declaration. It's just to make sure that a majority of Congress is on board. That is a reform that has been introduced in Congress. It's been actually was introduced for the first time in 2019. And it is wildly popular among both Republicans and Democrats. It has broader and deeper bipartisan support than pretty much anything else I've ever worked on. However, even though it got really, really close to the point of passing, or at least was voted out of committee by unanimous and near unanimous votes last year, the election happened. And then, since the election, there's basically been not much bipartisan legislation on anything. But I mean, the good news is that, it is so widely understood to be a needed and common sense reform that I do think that it is a question of when rather than if.
So I like to end by asking a question that I always get from listeners, which is, what can citizens do? What can people do? It seems that one would be to put pressure on lawmakers, let them know that they want this sort of check on this type of overuse of emergency
Yeah.
powers, and some limits on the deployment of troops on U.S. soil. But
Yeah.
what else can people do as they're, I think people feel helpless, they feel afraid.
Right.
What can people do in this moment?
I would say speak out, and whether that's going to a town hall to, raise this with your representatives, or writing a letter to the editor, or posting on social media.
Mhm.
I think it's really important. I think once people understand the stakes here,
Mhm.
they tend to be against it, right? And we've seen some polling showing that what the president is doing in Los Angeles, that most people do not support it, right? But I think being vocal about it, educating, talking to friends and neighbors, and sort of making sure that people are aware of the dangers here, because I do think that if the public opposition to this reaches a certain threshold, I think President Trump pays attention to that. And in some ways, he might pay more attention to it than he does to the courts. I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen sort of a wholesale just ignoring of court orders by this administration. I mean, there've definitely been some issues there.
Yes.
But the reason why we haven't, they haven't sort of followed through on some of the social media posts about, the courts don't control the executive branch, is because 80 to 90% of Americans, when polled, say that the president has to obey court orders.
Yeah.
And I do think that this administration does pay attention, maybe not to, some segments of the public opinion may not, they might not pay that much attention to, but if you start to see numbers like that, they pay attention. So express your opposition, make your opposition known, not by throwing rocks, not by, but through peaceful protest, through, talking to your representatives, going to town halls, talking to, posting on social media, all of the ways that I said. I think that's important.
It really, really is. And I think especially on the local and community level, that is particularly important. I mean, I am very aware that I can go on, MSNBC or whatever network and talk till I am blue in the face. And there are a certain segment of people who I'm not going to break through to, but people across America listen to their neighbors. They listen to the people in their churches. They listen to the other parents of children in their kids' schools. They listen to each other at town hall meetings. Yes, there's sometimes shouting and discourse increasingly now, but the local officials hear them, state officials hear them. And that is such a powerful tool in the hands of people. And I think it just needs to be emphasized again and again.
Yes. And the message is, this is not normal. We have a president, not a king. And if we want to keep it that way, we have to make sure that the president isn't able to just use the military as a domestic police force whenever he wants.
Liza Goitein, thank you so much for this conversation. It is so needed right now, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to all you listeners. I will be back next week with another episode of Justice by Design. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're listening wherever you get your podcast, also follow Justice by Design. Give me 5 stars, because that helps other people find this podcast. And episodes like this, I think, are really important. Knowledge is power. And so not just being outraged, but understanding exactly what the law is, what the procedures are supposed to be, how this is not normal, and why is crucial to being able to use your voice to effectuate a difference. I hope this episode today made you smarter. It made me smarter. And I look forward to talking again next week on Justice by Design. Thank you so much.